Very good evening, everyone. On behalf of JanyuTech Technologies, I warmly welcome you to Saturday Talk. Today's session is titled 250 Years of America. As the United States marks 2.5 centuries since its founding, it presents an opportunity to reflect not only on its remarkable historical journey, but also on its enduring influence on international politics, economics, technology, and the evolving global order. We are privileged to have us here today a distinguished scholar to guide us through such an important subject. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Arvind Kumar, Professor and Dean of the School of International Relations and Peace Studies at Nalanda University. Dr. Kumar has devoted over 3 decades to the study and teaching of international relations and strategic affairs. He has previously served as a faculty member at the National Institute of Advanced Studies, Bangalore, and has served as a chairperson of SIS Jawaharlal Nehru University, one of India's leading institutions for international studies. His academic work and insights have contributed significantly to understanding global politics and security. Dr. Kumar, we thank you for accepting our invitation and look forward to the talk. We are deeply honored to have you with us, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mayank, for this very kind introduction. And also at the outset, I thank JanyuTech for arranging this talk. I think it's very timely, very significant one. I think it's the right time to really understand the evolution of the United States, the transformation which it really has undergone, and what is it that really has shaped the US politics, US economy, and the US elevation of his status in the. So what I will do that I have divided my lecture into basically 3 parts. First part would really deal largely with the challenges which it had confronted, especially during American War of Independence, and how it really began, and the vision which really it articulated during that point in time. At the same time, how one can really also infer from the US behavioral pattern that the direction which the US had undertaken in during the early part of the 19th century, how that got changed after the Second World War. And again, we see that how there is a change and transformation, greater transformation in the overall approach of the US in placing or locating themselves in the. This is what I would like to do. The transformation and obviously the whole idea of transition and the current context, and then again the foreseeable future. So there is no denying the fact that the US obviously had to struggle for its existence during the later part of the 18th century, and how the American War of Independence was fought. Those 13 colonies basically, which again were having differing perspective at every level, how they were able to really sit together and saw that they are able to really come up with certain consensus on the issue of American independence. Obviously, a lot of challenges the US had confronted, a lot of corollary one can draw, especially from the experiences which the US had during that point in time, and the way the US behavioral pattern and their fundamental goals exist in the current context. If you go back and see the larger approach which the US had, what were the issues basically which were coming on the US way in terms of again becoming more assertive, that got reflected just after the US declared its independence in 1776. And obviously they came up with the idea that how much they can really have their governance structure that would lead the US in the overall manner by which they could be seen as not only independent, but also they have their own independent policies on every count. Point which I want to in fact draw here, that some of the issues which really led the US at that point in time again reflected that how the US again was not a very strong power. The US remained a very weak power, and obviously it had to seek help from France and Spain. And most of the time, if you see that what really happened during the decade of 1780s and 1790s, and the way in fact the whole idea of drafting their constitution, and more importantly, if one sees that Philadelphia Papers, one can really find a lot of contradictions in terms of their approaches in locating their place in the international system. So they were struggling to survive. And obviously, there is no denying the fact that their resilient characteristics, which basically reflected and obviously showed a greater way, or the greater way in terms of their, in fact, not only engaging with the world, but also moving ahead and finding their way and showing the world that, look, now the US is moving to that direction. I will take a case study of that famous Monroe Doctrine, and that Monroe Doctrine perhaps shaped the US characteristics during the 1823, and that was something which one has to really see, that how they wanted to keep themselves away from the larger integration process and engaging with the world. And the idea of isolationism, that how that could perhaps be the priority for the US strategy. And moreover, they also were very categorical in terms of saying that they will no more tolerate any of these interference from the outside or the European colonial powers in terms of their internal affairs. And obviously, any of these interference obviously will have a lot of detrimental impact on the larger peace and stability. The point which I'm trying to make here, that most of the strategy which the US evolved were largely connected to the point that how the US was not interested in assuming the responsibility at that given point in time. So there was a greater transformation which really one really sees happening, especially in the context of understanding the US fundamental goals and their behavioral pattern after the Second World War. So if you see the period of 1823 and take 100 years, or take less than 100 years, take the initiation of World War One and the US rule, I think they certainly were not having the larger footprints in terms of reflecting their assertiveness and also assuming the responsibility to lead the global affairs. The point which I'm trying to make here, that US basically was moving in a direction which was nowhere near to their overall assertiveness in terms of their identity. They certainly were trying to find ways and mechanisms to deal, especially with all their internal contradictions and the way the US got unfolded in terms of holistic country, as you know, from 13 colonies and transition to 50 states of the US. You see that how the things basically were reflected in the approach of the United States. And most of the debates which really were shaping the US intentions largely were connected to the point that they were very categorical in terms of emphasizing on how best they can move ahead, and also see that their focus remains completely inward, and they could certainly be moving ahead in terms of emphasizing on their development and improving upon their economy. Great Depression of 1930s again gave some sort of a way to the US in terms of addressing to the larger concerns which were impacting not only on their rising hyperinflation, but also seeing that their economy in no way would help them in terms of gaining ascendancy across global spectrum. The point which I want to make here, that the US had no intention whatsoever in terms of occupying the center stage of global politics. What really shaped the US approach, that perhaps can be understood largely in terms of their radical transformation in their behavioral pattern during the Second World War. Their entry to the Second World War also happened very dramatically, and obviously happened at a much later date and year. In 1941, the US obviously intervened. And if you see the overall the course which was being guided during the Second World War, and the overall the confrontation between the Allied power and the Axis power, these two obviously were of different nature because of the capabilities which were varying in terms of their overall strength. The point which again one has to infer about the US understanding of the world system, that really perhaps happened during the Second World War, that how the time has come for the United, and that is what got reflected in their approach in managing two types of governance system and the governance structure. One was the economic governance structure, and the second was the larger, in fact, global governance structure. And in that context, I think they already had demystified the presence and the existence of the League of Nations. They wanted to see that how the covenant of the League of Nations after the war gets ended, and what role the US can play in terms of making the whole world stable, and also moving ahead in a direction by which they can become a part of agenda. This was the crux of their understanding of the world system, and the transformation which I was talking to you with regard to the US approach, one can understand from the overall Articles of Confederation in 1776, which was very short-lived for 7-8 years. And again, if you see the overall constitution which they had come up with during 1787 to 1789, and how that constitution really guided the behavioral pattern of the US. And ultimately, if you see the overall approach which they adopted in terms of moving ahead and understanding the pulse of the international system, got reflected in terms of adopting two types of governance structure. One was the economic governance model, which they based on understanding that what could really help the US to become a part of agenda setting in the economic and financial sector. And that obviously they came up with the idea of establishing the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank by organizing the Bretton Woods in 1944. And in 1945, as you know, how the UN obviously replaced the existing League of Nations, and the covenant of the League of Nations got transformed into the Charter of the United Nations. If you see the post 1945 and try to analyze that what shaped the US intention, what shaped the US behavioral pattern, and what shaped the US fundamental goal, it is very clear. Because they were obviously having the idea that now the time had come for the US to lead the world. One is that you assume the responsibility, and other is the conferment. Conferment by the rest of the world on the US obviously was not that easy for the United States because it had to show the result. But it assumed the responsibility that now the US can move ahead and see that it has really all the wherewithals to assume the center stage and also move ahead in the direction by which it can really remain in the international system. But how the world was divided, I think that is a very interesting point. And here I would like to again bring to notice that how the world was divided and how this antagonistic power, how the allied power became the antagonist. And if you see this whole debate, overall transformation from being an allied power and becoming an antagonistic power just after the war got ended was very interesting to understand, because that point in time, the US obviously had to see that it really remains a very strong pole in the justice system, and it had the fear that the antagonistic power, the so-called the formerly Soviet Union, how they could really come on the US way in terms of not only challenging the overall gaining of the US ascendancy in the justice system, but also becoming some sort of an opposite pole, and that could perhaps be the reason for the US not to realize its dream and its goal. So the fundamental goal of the US was how they could checkmate the overall behavioral patterns which the Soviets had in terms of expanding their communist mode of production across the internet. And that perhaps was one of the primary reason for the US US adoption of various policies to checkmate the overall role for the Soviet Union in expanding their communist mode of production. And obviously the division of the world system. As you know, the world system became bipolar, and that perhaps became one part of the challenge for the US. If you try to analyze the United States, especially in terms of inferring from their behavioral pattern, and go back and see each of the presidency, starting from President Roosevelt, who died in the office while the World War II was going on, and the person who succeeded him was President Harry Truman. And obviously, Truman had difficulties in terms of comprehending the world system because of the challenges which really became much more difficult to grapple with. And obviously, they had the wherewithals, but the strategy which the Soviets really had evolved were certainly posing a lot of challenges for the United States to really see that it really is able to contain the growing influence of the Soviet Union, and more importantly, the communism across the globe. And mostly that was the major priority of the US in that context. So the US obviously moved ahead in that direction. One singular event obviously helped the US to elevate its status in the data system was the advent of nuclear. That perhaps was the beginning of a new era in international relations, because of the fact that the possession of the nuclear weapon provided a different feature, provided a different identity for the United States, especially in the context of their ascendancy. What point I want to make here, and I want to argue later when I bring the various other aspects of the development which the US had witnessed, and how through those developments US was able to raise its status or elevate its status, especially in terms of transitioning to become a superpower. And that perhaps was the beginning of a much greater debate, especially happening because that posed challenge to its adversary, the so-called Soviet Union, and how both the US and the Soviet Union led to sort of competition, and that competition led to sort of a very difficult task for bringing peace and stability across the globe. Because what happened that each of the developments which the US was having, that was seen getting replicated by the Soviet Union or vice versa. And in that context, I think the challenges remain far greater, especially in the context of not only comprehending these many developments, but also shaping the US behavioral pattern in a manner by which it was able to really remain a very strong port in the point which I'm trying to make here, that the President Truman really had a difficult time in terms of grappling with the emerging situations which were totally not predicted during the World War II, and these were certainly not seen some sort of getting articulated in terms of having certain vision, especially in the US context at that point in time. So everything was spontaneous. When we talk about the US strategy, and we would like to really compare with other countries' strategies, it was not that different in the context of spontaneity. Because any of the action, there's something called action reaction cycle. Any action taken by the United States obviously was, in fact, seen to be coming a different reaction from the Soviet Union. And that really was seen to be again a very difficult for both the countries to compete with, because both the countries were moving ahead in terms of creating their the point to note here is that how the US was able to comprehend and move ahead in the direction by which it could really be seen as a very important, responsible player in the international. It used many cards, especially in the context of its existence, and obviously it used its strength largely in the context of pioneering many of these technologies, and obviously putting much emphasis on the research and development in strategic core areas. The strategic core competencies which the US achieved because of its primacy in research and development on many of the areas, that really decided and shaped the US orientation in terms of comprehending the rest of the world, and also placing itself in a manner by which it remained a very important country, not only for its allies, but also for its overall approach to the international system. Here you see the transition. I was talking to you about the Monroe Doctrine, and how in fact post 45 again got changed in terms of the US strategy, how the Monroe Doctrine could not really could not get placed in any context, especially in the era of rivalry which the US had with the Soviet Union, and the overall engagement with the world, that really became a part of, in fact, priority for the US, where the US obviously became a sort of country where it wanted to build alliance with the rest of the world, where it saw that look, the Soviet Union is going to come. They basically were there much before the Soviets would have arrived. What I'm trying to argue here, that most of the doctrine and strategy which the US adopted and evolved just after the Second World War were mainly to deal with the larger goal which the Soviets had, expanding their communism, and the so-called Truman Doctrine, how the US comprehended much before the Soviets could have reached Greece and Turkey, because that could perhaps be able to help the Soviets to expand their influence, and that could have been seen as a detrimental impact on the point, which is very important here, that how the US approach to the international system got completely changed after 1945. And again, if you see, this is very important, that look, everything takes its own course. And if you see the current context and the contemporary debate, that how the US again is mostly becoming and moving ahead towards isolationism, because of the fact that whatever the US did in the last 80 years, this really is not seen getting continued, largely because of the fact that the change in the policy and the approach is completely not to really strengthen the alliance, but also to see that how the alliance system really finds a different place for itself. I think alliance system, which really happened to be constant in the US foreign policy, that is no more an area where the US puts emphasis anymore. And you know that how the overall emphasis which President Trump has made right now, make America great again, has certainly a different connotation where it's nothing wrong. I think everyone has to see that how that could really help in restoring the pride of a country by putting more emphasis on the inward or the domestic issues, and that is what the US really is into in the current. If you see the last 80 years, I think the US obviously has elevated its status, has maintained its glory, has obviously been able to be very much consistent in terms of its approach in expanding the horizon, especially in the field of its strategic core competencies area. And there's no denying the fact that it really has emphasized mostly on moving ahead and engaging with the like-minded countries, but at the same time, obviously, those engagement with the world which the US has in the current context obviously is in a of different nature. The point which I am trying to make here, that the 250 years of the United States perhaps provides us with a very holistic idea of a country's behavioral pattern from a multi-dimensional approach, where one has to understand the political dimension, the economic dimension, the technological dimension, the diplomatic dimension, and each of the dimension obviously you can't really read in isolation. You have to be, you have to interlink all these dimensions in a manner by which you get to know about the larger intention of the United States all these years. If you see what really happened during 50s, obviously the US was moving ahead in the direction that would have given the US a different space, a different place for itself in the international system, and that perhaps was seen to be challenged by the Soviet Union, because by the end of 40s, Soviet Union also acquired nuclear weapon. The acquisition of nuclear weapon by the Soviet Union again was the beginning of a different context altogether, where both the nations were putting more and more emphasis in terms of achieving primacy by acquiring more and more nuclear weapons and more technologies that could perhaps provide them to maintain a balance of power. And that is something which was the crux of the US strategy and the Soviet Union's strategy. If you see the later part of 50s, when the US obviously started pioneering its technologies through R&D in having information superiority. Information superiority is something which is very important and which was the crux of the US strategy, because they wanted to have global surveillance system. They wanted to really see that how the US really has the best possible mechanism to gather intelligence information. They wanted to have the best possible surveillance system. They wanted to be pioneer of reconnaissance system. So again, if you see the overall primacy which the US attached, largely in the context of acquiring their intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capabilities, through which they wanted to really have information superiority. And in that information superiority, you find that they have both the information dominance. The point which I would like to make here again, just for a better understanding, that if a nation has these mechanisms in place, their strategy to deal with the world will be better. The evolution of the strategy, if they have a better information mechanism, gathering mechanism, they can certainly deal with the world in a better manner. So again, the US was of the idea that how is they could lead the world by having a better strategy, how is they could the minds of the world. This is certainly not seen to be done in isolation, and obviously they wanted to see that how through this they are everywhere, and they certainly are able to cope up with the challenges which the world was confronting. They have had the failure, and you know that they already had seen a lot of challenges coming from elsewhere, and you can take the case study of understanding their behavioral pattern during the Korean War, and obviously the Taiwan Strait crisis, which obviously was the beginning for a country which again right now has become a part of challenge for the United States, that is China. China, again, the ascendance of China across global spectrum happened because of its experiences during the Korean War and the Taiwan Strait crisis. Because Mao basically felt that that China cannot afford to get bullied by either of the power blocks, and they would like to have their own independent strategic program. So if you see the evolution of China as a force to reckon with vis-a-vis the United States, you will find that most of the reason and rationale had come from the United States behavioral pattern. And that is something which we need to understand because of the fact that China's emphasis on the research and development in acquiring strategic core competencies grew during the later part of 50, and one can really see the origin and the evolution of that, and obviously see that how China has become a major force, especially in the current context, which again has gone much deeper into not only preparing itself for any type of eventuality, but also coming up as a very major pole in this multipolar system, which obviously that China wants to be unipolar in Asia in a multipolar world. Again, I don't want to digress the whole idea of the 250 years of the US, but what I'm trying to say here that most of the things which we are seeing right now, especially from China, happening in China, is only due to the fact that the US again was one of the major reason for its development. The point again which becomes very pertinent to understand that the decade of 60s, 70s, 80s, every decade was so important for the US to elevate its status. As I said, that 40s, the decade of 40s and 50s, the US completely centered on the advances in nuclear. So what I'm trying to say, the United States, every decade was very important to understand its role in the global affairs. Every decade was important for the US to really elevate its status. And one can really take the case study of the advances in science and technology. The decade of 40s and 50s was largely devoted to gain ascendancy in the military application of nuclear technology. The decade of 60s and 70s, they basically completely invested in enhancing their capabilities in the military application of outer space technology, which again they have been continuing, but the focus remained these 60s and 70s completely outer space technology. If you see the whole decade of 80s and 90s for that reason, their complete focus was on advances in information and communication technologies, ICT. If you see this, the 50 years period, 1945 to the beginning of the 21st century, you will find that every action of the US was centered on gaining ascendancy, and through that ascendancy, how they can really evolve a strategy, and though the strategy can help the US to keep their position in the position as the main actor of the global or the international system. But at the same time, you will see that it's not necessary to highlight that even if they had that ascendancy, but they really had found a lot of challenges coming from elsewhere in the world. And a lot of things one can argue that they really put most of the emphasis in acquiring many of the capabilities to improve their military capabilities, to see that how they, through their strategic capabilities, how they really are able to negotiate with the rest of the world from a position of strength. But at the same time, they certainly lacked in terms of understanding the larger pulse of the international system, and that is how the crisis which the US really confronted, whether it was to do with the Cuban Missile Crisis or for that matter, the involvement in Vietnam, 1965 onwards, you will find that the US certainly had very limited knowledge on the capabilities of the emerging nation, which were largely in Asia. And the point which one has to emphasize here, that though the US basically US was able to acquire many of these, pioneer many of these capabilities, but they obviously found a lot of challenges from within, especially because of the fact that their attempt to acquire knowledge about the rest of the world kept helping them, but at the same time, understanding the overall role of the nations which were showing resilience in terms of their existence, that perhaps really was not found in the lexicon of the US strategists.
My question is regarding the importance of dollar in world trade. And last few years, I think now the other currencies and other countries are trying to do trade in non-dollar ways. Do you think that this is the future, given the predominance of dollar in every industry, every country trade? So do you think China or Russia or the euro currencies can do bilateral trade as is being talked across countries? Do you think there is a success likely in few years time in that? Because that is the main hegemony that US creates with the dependence on dollar. So maybe oil trade or maybe finance and bank funds. So are we looking at something at the end of the, say 5 years down the line? Do you think that this might change really on ground, or this is just talk between countries?
I think it's a very valid question, very important question. So what has happened that the predominance of dollar in the context of conducting world trade, that remains as it is because of the pressure tactics which the US knows how to really put the pressure tactics and use that to promote and leverage their interests. And this is what they have done exactly. In fact, you may have come across some of these debates were coming up as a part of priority by a BRICS group of countries, and they wanted to really argue that now the time has come for de-dollarization and how there could be sort of a currency which could really be used by the BRICS group of countries to establish. And the pressure tactics which President Trump used in terms of telling these BRICS group of countries that they will again be punished by having more percentage of sanctions against them. All this has stopped that debate completely. So I think in the foreseeable future, I'm not seeing any chance of getting the dollar becoming less dormant. I think dollar is going to be the medium of world trade, and unless and until there is a common voice coming from the countries of global south, where India has to play a very leading role, which I doubt whether India could play a leading role in the context of showing its assertiveness vis-a-vis the US approach of not to de-dollarize, then only things can happen. But at the same time, if you see the perspective which the BRICS countries had, and they were of the opinion that look, the Bretton system really has failed completely. The International Monetary Fund has not helped the developing world, and that too not to the emerging economies. And obviously, the World Bank always worked for the interests of the United States. There is nothing for the rest of the world. So again, if you see, those debates again are coming, but to a large extent, finding an alternative to the medium of world trade against dollar, I think is not going to be that easy for the United States. So dollar is going to be there, existing, and obviously that could perhaps be remaining as the medium of world.
Yeah, Professor, it was a very interesting talk. But looking back, we see that US was also once an agrarian country with vast territory, of course, with small population. And they adopted a lot of strategies and doctrines and whatever, and they have reached where they are. And today, why world's second, third, fourth, fifth economies? We are also claiming that we are becoming one of the recognizable economies globally. When do you think we will also become a destination for global citizens? Today, as everyone, a good size of the population, whether it is from Eastern Europe, India, China, wherever, they want to have US as their destination. Why such a thing is not happening? Today US is a destination, Europe is a destination, but not Russia, not China, not India. Are we heading towards that? Or is there something which we are badly missing? Of course, population factor I can understand.
I think the US remains a country of opportunity. Go there, and if you make a survey of the US population and the immigration happening, you will find a lot of persons basically who have gone there from the rest of the world. They certainly are not in white collar jobs. They get, despite all challenges, it seems that they have a better living, and they also basically find that they can really use in whatever way their skills that really gets respected. So China is yet to emerge as cosmopolitan. Russia is yet to emerge as cosmopolitan. Do you know, if you go to Moscow, I don't know, nothing is written in English or any other language other than this. You can't really. I visited Moscow, and then I had a lot of challenge. Technically, one local person was with us. She was our interpreter. So we had no difficulties, but I think a lot of these issues basically come. You can't go and settle down in Moscow so easily, despite the fact that many Indians have gone to Moscow for studies and they have settled down. I know many cases where they have done that. So, but they have very limited opportunities. They don't have the opportunity, the scale of opportunity in the United States. I think that really has grown over the decades, and that is something which what attracting. Right now, I think there is a reverse brain drain. All of you are aware that how President Trump's policy basically has negated the idea of moving ahead and going and settling down in the US, because those of them basically who were already there, they are getting back to India. They don't want to be there. There is a space for everyone. This is what I feel with regard to that. India is certainly a country, but we need to provide opportunities for. We have, but we first and foremost we have to address to our needs. We are 1.6 billion persons, and unless we address to our own people, how can we really get the people from elsewhere in the world? And plus, there is no comparison virtually in terms of the US focus on their development and the way India has been focusing on India's